One of the things that we propose in that list, there were five, we call them 5 R's, and people can read about that on change.org/take back your country. But we suggested 5 things. Among one of them was recall elections. And you raised this, did you not, with a minister in the Farrell government? How did that arise?
Yeah, there was a proposal to that effect. I'm trying to remember the detail of how that arose, actually. I remember the discussion.
Mr. Farrell went to the election because there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the previous Labor government. And people were feeling we've elected a government and we don't want the government because they're not performing very well. And Barry O'Farrell wrote a piece for the Sydney Morning Herald in which he promised that recall elections would be considered. He'd call together some important committee to consider introducing recall elections in New South Wales. That is, the people by a petition, a certain percentage of the electorate, having the power to recall a particular politician, or perhaps even the whole government, the whole assembly, to an election, so that the people would have this sword of Damocles over the politicians, being able at any time to recall them to another election. And you might remember Barry O'Farrell set up a committee. I think they were surprised that the committee came down with a conclusion 2-1. George Williams, professor at the University of New South Wales, dissented, but the committee decided by majority that recall elections are compatible with the Westminster system. Well, they obviously are, because they exist at least in one province in Canada, so they obviously can coexist with Westminster. And you asked a minister why they weren't proceeding. He was the Attorney General at the time. You asked him why they had this report, why they weren't proceeding with him, and he told you that something was different.
Yeah, I think the important point with that, with the recall elections, is that it doesn't necessarily, although it could be a whole government, it could also be an individual member. So I think that was really where the point was if you had someone, for example, Craig Thompson, if you remember back to his misbehaviour, and he was certainly doing things that were probably not in line with the community expectation and financially and otherwise. So I would have thought it very appropriate that the people of that electorate might have wished to recall him to an early election. But if you had something that was more widespread than an individual member, I think there's also merit to having mechanics by which you could force an early election of the entire government.
And when you asked the Attorney General why they weren't proceeding with it, having got the favourable report, he said, well, things are different now. Where we were in opposition when we made that promise, we're in government now. Do you remember that?
Vaguely, I remember. I can't remember the detail of the conversation, but yes.
It obviously was locked into my mind. He said, things are different now, we're in government. So they filed that report away. It's still gathering dust somewhere in Macquarie Street. And you'd think that with what's going on in New South Wales, it's time also to bring in recall elections in New South Wales. You should be able to do that. And that sword of Damocles is very important. If the politicians know the people have power over them, I think it makes them accountable 24/7, doesn't it?
Yeah, it would certainly keep them on their toes. And I think that's the point. You don't necessarily need to exercise these mechanics, but simply the fact that they would exist, I think, would be enough to deter misbehaviour on the part of the politicians.